Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kirsten Snow. I'm the Communications Director for the Pennsylvania Policy Center. Welcoming everyone as you join our State Policy Action Call. Hello, hello. Make sure everybody gets connected before we join. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kirsten. I'm the Communications Director for Pennsylvania Policy Center. We really appreciate you being here today so that we can talk about the budget. Just so that you know, all lines for attendees are muted so that everyone can hear our featured speakers. If you have a question for any of our panelists, please type it in the Zoom chat at the bottom of the screen. When we go to Q&A, we will pose as many of your questions to our guests as time permits. If you have any audio or video problems, please send a message in the chat to me, or you can certainly send it to Adrienne, who is our tech guru. At this point, I want to make sure to welcome our panelists to this event. We are super excited to be joined by Laura Nevitt from the Keystone Progress Education Fund, Priyanka Reyes-Kaura from Children First, and Dr. Laura Beltran, our own PPC Legislative and Strategy and Policy Director. So thank you so much for all of you joining us. I wanted to give you a little bit of housekeeping as well. If you attempt to unmute your microphone, you may have discovered that all attendees' lines are muted. We do this to minimize disruptions so that everyone can hear what our featured panelists have to say today. However, this is an interactive discussion. We do want you to use the opportunity to submit questions at any time during the meeting. Please feel free to drop those in the Zoom chat, and our moderator will field and pose as many of those questions as possible. If you have any trouble with your microphone or with being able to unmute or anything like that, please reach out to me, Kirsten, or Adrienne, again, our tech guru. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Jeff.
Welcome. Thanks so much, everybody. We are going to get started here with our roundtable discussion with what I'm calling here a popcorn round, where we're going to go to each of our panelists and ask them some quick questions about what are the things that they see as some of the biggest victories in the budget. And we'll start off with that question first. So we're going to go right down the line in the order of the speakers. What do you see as one of the big victories coming out of the 2026-2027 budget? First to you, Priyanka, with Children First.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Hey, I'm Priyanka Reyes-Kaura with Children First, and also part of the PA Schools Work Coalition that Penn Policy Center is also a leading member of. To answer your question, a third year of historic education funding through the adequacy supplement, which drove over $500 million to underfunded school districts. Huge victory.
All right. Moving on the line, Laura Nevitt, Keystone Progress Education Fund.
I was laughing at this question because we don't actually do budget work. So I would really only say the victory is probably that a budget got finished instead of dragging on way longer than it did last year, because it's not a great budget.
Fair enough. Thanks, Laura. We'll go now to our other Laura in the meeting. And if you have questions for one of our Lauras, please specify which Laura we're talking about. It is my colleague, Laura Beltran, here at the Pennsylvania Policy Center. Laura.
Hi, everyone. Laura Beltran, Policy Research and Legislative Strategy Director for Pennsylvania Policy Center. And I think with this one, I have to side with Priyanka and with Laura. It was not a completely great budget. However, I think the third installment and the $526 million we got specifically for adequacy are going to go a long way for public school districts that are in desperate need of these funds. So yeah, I think that's definitely one of the few victories we had.
Thanks, Laura. And also from the PA Policy Center team, our Executive Director, Felicity Williams.
Thank you, Jeff. As Jeff said, my name is Felicity Williams. I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Policy Center. If you guys join us regularly, you are very familiar with my face, normally being the one that introduces us to kick us off. But anyway, I'm going to build upon everything that my colleagues here said today. Laura, I have to make a joke that as someone who does not, Nevitt, I'll say Laura Nevitt, as someone who does not do budget and policy work, you definitely then read PPC's analysis because you summed it up pretty well in terms of the budget. I would say the biggest victory is that Pennsylvania continued making meaningful progress towards adequately funding our public schools while largely avoiding cuts to state level cuts to essential health and human services investments.
All right. Thank you to all of our panelists. We'll go into a quick second round question here. What were some of the what was the big mistake? What was something, a missed opportunity? Priyanka, what do you see as missed opportunity in the budget?
I would say missed opportunity for lawmakers to increase the funding that goes to all school districts through basic and special education funding formulas. Both of them got a small increase, $50 million each, but not enough to really grapple with rising inflation and other costs across the state.
Thanks. Laura Nevitt. Hey, you're on mute.
See, I muted. For us, obviously, the biggest miss is that wages were not raised in any way, shape, or form. Now, interesting enough, we were okay with the bill that was presented because it didn't get us to a living wage. But it, and they had a great opportunity to do that, and they missed it.
Good point. Laura Beltran.
A lot of options to pick from the revenue side because we did not have any major revenue solution passed to. I know it's a one sentence, but I feel like I just need to name a few. So we did not legalize and tax adult use cannabis. That's a missed one. We did not regulate and tax skill games even after we got a Supreme Court decision. We specifically for PPC priorities, we did not pass any corporate net income tax reforms, including combined reporting. And then I also just want to echo Laura Nevitt's comments that we also did not pass any minimum wage legislation that could have helped about 1 million Pennsylvanians.
Good points, Laura. Felicity.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm going to try to summarize them together, and you're going to notice some key themes here from us, right? So I will say the biggest missed opportunity was failing to pair those important investments in avoiding healthcare cuts and increasing education funding with a real affordability agenda that raises wages and creates sustainable recurring revenue through a fairer tax system.
There we go. That's a pretty sobering reality. Last question here from this popcorn round for all of our speakers. How do you think what happened and what didn't happen with this year's budget might impact the 2027-2028 legislative session and budgeting next year? Priyanka, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I'm here to focus on education. And so in a positive way, I think lawmakers have made clear that they are committed to filling this adequacy gap. And so I see the last 3 years of progress as a hopeful sign that next year will include an additional large investment to continue filling our adequacy gap. We're making good progress here, and I think we can continue to hope and expect that lawmakers will keep doing that.
All right. Laura Nevitt. And you're muted. There you go.
I got it. I think the opportunity, obviously, given that affordability and wages, we know are the number one thing for most people. And while we didn't pass any legislation, it actually gives us the opportunity to work on better wage legislation going forward. And as we push on that publicly and make more noise, that hopefully becomes something we can work on next legislative session.
Laura Beltran.
Yeah, so, well, definitely the first one is going to be the federal cost shifting that I think legislators are going to really come to grapple with. We at PPC have already done some preliminary work of what that's going to cost the state. And we know that for SNAP, it's somewhere close to 420 million. We also have additional 150 million. And I feel like I would not be PPC if I did not bring the structural deficit into account that has been a can kick down the road, for lack of a better word. And previous estimates already put it at 4.6 to 4.8 billion. we don't know if that necessarily is going to increase with the federal cost shifting, but it's a probability. And we can't just keep passing skinny budgets. So I think next year the legislature is going to have a tall order to meet the needs of Pennsylvanians.
Thanks, Laura. And Felicity.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes, so again, building upon my colleagues, we are pretty united in a lot of these themes and messages. Our biggest challenge that we're going to have to grapple with in next year's budget is how we are going to meet our growing obligations. Laura mentioned federal shifts. That's an important one, but we had an existing structural deficit that we have not addressed and was unaddressed this year. As Priyanka said, we need to continue school funding commitments. And so without new revenue or simply passing today's bills, which is what happened this year, into another year, it will require political will to address some of these challenges. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later when we talk about looking ahead to the election this fall and next year. So teaser for that.
All right. Thank you, Felicity. And thank you to all of our panelists for giving us some initial thoughts, some ideas here about what we're looking at with this year's budget. We're now going to take a little bit of a deeper look at some of the specific things that have already been mentioned. We're going to get to start off first with Priyanka Reyes-Kaura from Children First, who's going to be talking about education. I would say you're probably the sunny speaker of this panel discussion here, Priyanka. Go ahead.
Thank you. That is a role that I don't take lightly because we all need some positivity. And, last year's budget was very much delayed and a lot of uncertainty. This year's budget was both mostly on time-ish, we could say, early July, and had a lot of really great continued progress in education. So as I said before, I'm here with Children First and also part of the PA Schools Work statewide coalition that Penn Policy is also part of. And together we are very, very happy with the education funding improvements we saw this year. So I'm going to go into a little bit of a deeper dive. As I mentioned earlier, this year's budget had many increases in K-12 education that go to all of our public schools. First and foremost, $565 million of new funding for our adequacy and tax equity supplements. This is huge. This is history making, and I really don't want us to skip how important and groundbreaking this is. 364 school districts across the state receive adequacy funding because they're historically underfunded. And an additional chunk of school districts get tax equity funding because they have an extremely high local tax burden. And so these two new funding streams, they've been around for 3 years. They are really a huge commitment from our state lawmakers to change those facts and make public school funding more fair in the long term. There were also smaller investments that I mentioned earlier, $50 million each in increases to basic education and special education funding formulas, which go to all 500 school districts in the state, and a $10 million increased investment in career and technical education. And all of these passed with bipartisan support. And so we see just year over year and in the last few years, real sustained improvements. A little bit more on the adequacy and tax equity lines that are so groundbreaking. Out of the 565 million, 526 million is to close adequacy gaps at those 364 school districts that have unconstitutional shortfalls. There's an additional $6 million to make sure that every school district gets a $50,000 minimum supplement in the adequacy fund. And then $32 million are the tax equity funding for districts with a very, very high local tax burden. Adequacy funding is a constitutional requirement. That doesn't make it a guarantee, but in 2023, the Commonwealth Court declared that our school funding system is unconstitutional and required lawmakers to totally change the way that we fund our schools. And lawmakers' answers to that is adequacy funding. And so we've had 3 years in a row now of lawmakers committing to filling that adequacy shortfall. The 3 years, there's a lot of threes here. In that 3 years, lawmakers have filled 33% or 1/3 of the total shortfall. So it's big progress. Also, 33% is only a third, so we still have a long way to go before all of our schools are fairly funded. But we do have bipartisan agreement that this is an issue, and lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, they all have school districts in every pocket of the state that benefit from this adequacy supplement. So if lawmakers were to continue at the pace that they've been going, we would close the entire adequacy shortfall in 6 years. That's a big if, and also 6 years is a long time. So really happy with the progress that's made, and there's a lot to go. The funding that's gone out so far is already really working for students. And so in the first 2 years that lawmakers put out the new funds, we saw rural, urban, and suburban school districts do amazing things with those first two increases. Across the state, we saw smaller class sizes, increased staffing, including hiring of key teachers and counselors and other staff members, reduced CTE wait lists. School climates are starting to improve. We're seeing growth in literacy, achievement, and preparation. We have a whole report that goes way more in depth on all of these things. But I'm just so excited to see what happens with a third year. If school districts were already able to make real concrete improvements in just 2 years, I mean, the pace of change is going to just continue to increase. And I just know that our teachers and school leaders are going to do really great things with the next year of funding. There were some other things that I mentioned earlier, other increases and policy changes that I just want to touch on lightly. Basic and special education, small increases. They were small increases. They were not really enough. And we hope that future year budgets will have larger increases in basic and special education, especially because our costs for education programming continue to rise. We did see some cyber charter reforms, so some tightening of some of the newer policies that help ensure students who are habitually truant are not sort of being admitted to cyber charter schools, being paid to go to cyber charter schools, and then not showing up for school. Additionally, some residency requirement changes. There had previously been problems where students who didn't live in the school district or even didn't live in Pennsylvania were being funded to attend cyber charter schools. And so there are some new tightening of policy language to make sure that doesn't happen. These are things that will continue to save school districts money. Also, we have two programs in Pennsylvania called EITC and OSTC that are our current tax credit voucher programs. And for the last 10 years before this year, those programs were increased every single year. This is the first year in 10 years that there has not been another increase to those programs. And that means that more of our public taxpayer dollars are being saved for the general fund instead of being reserved for tax credits. There were increases also in student teacher stipends, career technical education, and then there's a little thing that I'm excited about, a new bill that requires school districts to report data on their school facilities, which is a huge cost that school districts have that until now we just haven't had data about how much it will cost for school districts to maintain and repair their school buildings. And, those of us who I live in Philadelphia, there are so many school buildings here that have asbestos and lead in their pipes and no air conditioning and all kinds of really, really expensive and problematic things that make student learning suffer. And those things have just never been really measured. So starting next year, school districts will have to start sharing data, which is the first step for us to start reforming that funding system. There's a lot left to do. We still have a $3.8 billion adequacy gap to fill. We need our basic and special education funding line items to continue being increased to allow all school districts to keep up with inflation and pay all of their basic costs. We need more reform to the way that cyber charter schools are funded. And we need to maintain progress on all of these fronts simultaneously so that all of our public school students in Pennsylvania can access a high quality education, no matter what their zip code is. So that was my attempt to keep it short, but happy to go into more detail later.
Thank you, Priyanka. That was excellent. Not only did you present information, but you really did it in a very concise and helpful way. Moving on, we're going to talk now about minimum wage with Laura Nevitt. Laura.
Hello, everyone. I am not going to be as concise as Priyanka. Mostly, she had such a lovely slide deck. I feel underprepared now, but all good. I really want to just talk about, and it's not minimum wage; it's a living wage. As we mentioned, this past session, there was no increase in the state's minimum wage, and I'm sure, and I hope, and if you don't know, the state of Pennsylvania has not increased its minimum wage since 2009, so it's still at the federal level of 7.25. And as most of us here hopefully know, that the cost of living in Pennsylvania and nationally has far outpaced that. And so it is now the conversation we are having, and what we want to get folks on board with is no longer talking about raising the minimum wage, but getting to a living wage here in Pennsylvania. And so the MIT living wage calculator calculates that the minimum lowest in Pennsylvania is $23 an hour. And that is to just cover basic cost of living. And it's interesting, 39%. I was just doing a quick Google because I had a thought in my head, but while Priyanka was talking, 39% of people in Pennsylvania struggle to meet their basic living needs. That's an awful lot of people in Pennsylvania who are struggling. And so much of that is because they are not making wages that help them live. And so we need to change that. And we have, like I said, we have the opportunity, given they didn't pass a bill this past year. And so what we want to push is to go for that big, bold, let's be brave and not settle for what the other side is willing to give us. We need to come to them and demand and ask wages that meet the cost of living. And that is living wages. So this is what we're working on, and we hope that folks will join in that work. We also in the past, it's only been 3 months, April. How long ago was April? Federally, there has actually been 2 living wage bills, both on the House side and the Senate side, that would do a floor of 25. And so we also want to use that to come back to our state legislators and say, look, this is that your proposal of 15 by 2029 isn't going to cut it, because even if we did that, by the time we got to 2029, we would be back to having the same conversation. The cost of living would outpace that raise. And so we need to kind of get to a place where we're just saying living wages attached to a COLA, and then let's stop having this conversation, because then it's done and we can move on to fight other fights. Like fully funding education would be really helpful. So this is where we're at with what I now call wage work. I don't like to use the term minimum wage anymore, but we're talking about living wages and getting our state legislators as a policy to get up to speed to where wages should be for workers in Pennsylvania. So that's really in a nutshell.
All right. Thank you, Laura, and thanks for reminding us that we are actually fighting for a living wage, not just the bare minimum. Very important point. Moving on from one Laura to another. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, Jeff, because when you talk about minimum wage, our minimum wage now really is a poverty wage. Even the 15 that we talk about, that's still a poverty wage. So we want a living wage, and what they're talking about, we should always push back on them you're talking about a poverty wage. So it just makes it a little easier. Just say.
Yeah, definitely true. And an important reminder, Laura. From one Laura to another, we're going to go now to Laura Beltran, talking a little bit about revenue and missed opportunities there.
Which there are a lot of. But I would like to begin by saying that while this budget is balanced on paper, it does not necessarily mean that it is fully balanced. As we can see, there have been a lot of fixes, for lack of a better word, that we used in this budget to get it to balance. So just trying not to go too deeply into the details, but just so folks are aware, we're relying on 2 Medicaid cycle rolls. So we're shifting approximately 1.3 billion from the last cycle and pushing 1.3 billion to the further cycle. So we can keep doing this up until some point we're going to end up with roughly a 1.3 billion gap that we need to pay for. Then we're also reclaiming 1.24 billion in appropriations that were not spent. So that's basically the government saying, since you didn't spend it, we're going to save it for this budget that just passed. And then we have roughly 580 million in special fund transfers, as well as some other smaller tricks. So with that in mind, that this is a pseudo balanced budget, for lack of a better word, we can move on to what we missed in terms of revenue opportunities. And I kind of hinted a little bit at this in the beginning of the conversation, but I just wanted to put some numbers into that. So if we had legalized, licensed, and taxed cannabis, that would have been roughly 730 additional million that we would have to fund the priorities that we need. Similarly, if we had regulated and taxated skill games or video gaming terminals, we would have brought roughly 765 million. We do know that that decision is probably going to be coming down the pipeline because with the Supreme Court ruling, the General Assembly and the governor have a limited time frame to make that decision. And then we also have, and this again is PPC, one of PPC's priorities, is corporate net income tax reform, which would have brought roughly 328.4 million with increasing numbers in revenue as the years went by. And minimum wage increase, aside from all the benefits that would have been for many Pennsylvanians, roughly 1 million, because of these higher incomes, we would have likely had also additional personal income and sales tax revenue amounting roughly to 53.5 million up to 80 million. And this is just the proposals that were in the governor's budget, but ultimately were not enacted. However, there's still many other ways the Commonwealth could raise revenue, such as another PPC hint, worldwide combined reporting, which is basically the universal version of the water's edge and would target the corporations that are hiding profits in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. We would also have the possibility of a severance tax to shift from the impact fee, which is, if I do say so, a huge bargain on these massive oil companies to make them pay on what they're basically extracting from. A fair share tax reform, which would change a little bit our personal income tax to hopefully make individuals that have most of their money on dividends and stocks and not, the majority of us that are relying on wages and salaries. So we can capture those revenues from wealth more adequately, as well as, and this has been a big one, everything that has been related to data centers and specifically the sales and occupancy tax exemption that actually had some movement in the Senate during these budget negotiations, but ultimately it did not amount to much. And then just talking in terms of what this budget did fund. So what we saw mostly was a maintenance budget. Some of the proposals that we did see in the governor's initial proposal from February, such as the 100 million for the federal relief fund, which would aim to cover a tiny amount of all the changes that are coming down the pipeline in this coming year, especially considering that Medicaid changes haven't even kicked in. We're just seeing the beginning of the SNAP changes. Did not pass. So we're still trying to see. We also saw that the enacted permanent transit funding proposal from the governor of dedicating a specific stream did not pass. So we're slowly gonna come to terms with what has been enough in terms of maintenance and what really is maintenance funded, but it's not enough for everything that is coming down the pipe.
All right. Thank you, Laura. Don't want to cut you off there, but we'll move on now to Felicity Williams, telling us a little bit more about kind of the big picture and how this sets the stage for what might impact Pennsylvania this fall and even next year and beyond. Felicity, go ahead.
Thank you, Jeff. So I have the job of helping to thread together all of the things that you are hearing here today and think about how they will impact not only the elections that we have coming up in November, what are key policy priorities that we need to see reflected, but then also looking ahead at next year's budget. So throughout today's discussion, you've heard us return to some common themes and one central idea over and over and over again. This also will be a word that is not unfamiliar to anybody in this current environment: affordability. At Pennsylvania Policy Center, we often say affordability isn't a slogan, it's not a buzzword or a campaign theme. It's really an equation. Affordability equals household income plus public supports minus essential costs. And that's the framework we use to evaluate public policy. Does it help people earn more? Does it maintain the public or expand the public investments families rely on? Does it lower the essential costs people can't avoid? Budgets reflect the choices we make about both spending and taxes or revenue that we bring in. If we only debate what Pennsylvania can afford to invest in without also debating how Pennsylvania raises the revenue, we're only having half the budget conversation. When we look at this year's budget through that lens, the picture is mixed. So as you've heard us talk about, this budget did maintain and even expand in the terms of education, some important priorities. It largely maintained essential health and human services, and it avoided some of the most harmful cuts that were on the table. But maintaining important investments is not the same as solving Pennsylvania's affordability crisis. That is why I see this budget less as a finish line and more as a bridge to the 2026 elections and the 2027 legislative session. This November, Pennsylvanians will make 3 important decisions, at least at the state level. They will elect the next governor, who will propose the next state budget, will lead the executive agencies responsible for implementing many of these policies, and ultimately sign or veto legislation. They will determine whether Republicans continue more than 3 decades of control of the Pennsylvania Senate, and they will determine whether Democrats retain or expand their narrow majority in the House, or whether control of that chamber changes. Those elections matter because they determine who will be responsible for answering 3 big questions that this budget left unresolved. The first question: how will Pennsylvania make life more affordable? As you've heard Laura Nevitt talk about today, this answer begins with household income. Families experience the affordability crisis every day. As Laura said, minimum wage has remained at just $7.25 an hour since 2009. But I want to note that our legislature has received a cost of living increase every year since then. As Laura Beltran said, more than 1 million workers across the Commonwealth currently earn $15 an hour or less, and so would therefore benefit directly or indirectly from raising it. The House acted this year. The Senate did not. They couldn't even bring a minimum wage increase to a final vote. That is simply just part of the legislative record. The next General Assembly will have to decide whether Pennsylvania finally moves beyond a wage floor that has remained unchanged for 17 years and is below poverty wages. Affordability is also about maintaining the public supports that allow families to thrive. So as we heard, this year's continued investment in public education is a very important, historic, and meaningful step forward. But progress is not completion. Pennsylvania still has billions of dollars remaining before fully meeting its constitutional obligation to adequately fund public schools. And affordability is also about lowering essential costs. Housing, I saw someone in the chat mention that. Healthcare, transportation, Laura Beltran spoke about that. Childcare, food access. These are not separate issues. They are all the affordability conversation. So the next budget should ask one fundamental question: Will this make life more affordable for Pennsylvanians? The second question we need to tackle is, how will Pennsylvania pay for these priorities? This year's budget, as Laura said, technically balanced the books, but it did so through a series of accounting tricks, such as paying one bill later so that it's not in this year's budget, it's in another budget, and doing some one-time transfers. It did not solve the Commonwealth's long-term structural revenue challenge. And to be clear, Pennsylvania did not arrive at this long-term structural challenge by accident. All of this is the result of choices and policy decisions. Over more than 2 decades, policymakers made a series of decisions that reduced what many profitable corporations contribute to the Commonwealth, including lowering the corporate net income tax rate, narrowing the corporate tax base, expanding corporate tax preferences, and maintaining opportunities for some large multi-state corporations to shift profits outside of Pennsylvania. You and I cannot avoid paying taxes by putting our money in a bank in a different state, and corporations should not be able to do that either. Our research estimates those policy choices now leave Pennsylvania collecting between $2.21 billion and $2.99 billion less in corporate tax revenue every year than if we had just maintained our historical corporate collections and policies. That is why one part of the For Our Commonwealth campaign at Pennsylvania Policy Center, as you heard Laura Beltran speak about, focuses on something called combined reporting, a very common sense reform that 28 other states and Washington, D.C. have already enacted. This helps ensure that large multi-state corporations pay taxes based on the business they actually conduct in Pennsylvania rather than shifting profits elsewhere. These corporations draw from the public investments that they are not fairly paying into. But corporations are only one part of Pennsylvania's tax fairness conversation. As you guys have heard me say, and I will keep saying, Pennsylvania is home to 23 billionaires and extraordinary concentrations of wealth. The question isn't whether we have the resources to invest in our future. We absolutely have them. The question is whether our tax system is designed to draw fairly from that wealth so we can make the investments Pennsylvanians need. That's why our For Our Commonwealth also calls for a fair share tax, because working people should not carry a disproportionate share of the responsibility for funding the Commonwealth, while those who have benefited the most from our economy contribute proportionately less. Right now, we have the 4th most unfair tax system in the country, and 2/3 of the core revenue that our state budget relies on comes from working people. It comes from personal income tax and sales tax. Those are the 2 largest general fund tax sources that draw on earnings, so work, income from work, and everyday consumption, which disproportionately impacts working people. A stronger revenue system isn't about collecting more for the sake of collecting more. It's about ensuring that Pennsylvania has the recurring revenue necessary to fund great schools. You heard Priyanka talk about wanting to increase the funding that goes to every school, to fund affordable health care, to fund reliable transportation, childcare, housing, and other public investments that make our Commonwealth more affordable. Fiscal responsibility is not simply balancing the books or making the numbers work for 1 year. It means building a revenue system capable of sustaining Pennsylvania's priorities for the long term. The third question we have to ask is, how should Pennsylvania decide where taxpayer dollars belong? And I want to use this example to talk about data centers. Pennsylvania's sales tax exemption for data center equipment is projected to cost taxpayers nearly $188 million this fiscal year, with projections exceeding $500 million annually within just a few years. That is a significant public investment. Whenever the Commonwealth commits that level of public resources, taxpayers deserve to know whether they are receiving an appropriate public return. And the evidence to date raises very serious questions. We have done some analysis on this, and so a little bit of these questions are rhetorical, but are these subsidies creating enough permanent family-sustaining jobs to justify their growing cost? No. Are communities receiving meaningful benefits? No. In fact, we know that there are very strong environmental concerns, as an example. What are the long-term impacts on electricity demand, water use, land use, and the environment? Will residential utility customers ultimately bear costs that should be paid by private developers? These are questions about accountability. Public subsidies should be accompanied by clear evidence of public benefit. If taxpayers are making a substantial investment, policymakers should be able to demonstrate that Pennsylvanians are receiving an appropriate return. Finally, the next governor and General Assembly will write the next budget in a very different federal landscape. Laura touched on this a little bit. Many of the largest federal Medicaid, SNAP, and health coverage changes have not yet taken full effect, but Pennsylvanians are already feeling the consequences. Approximately 177,000 Pennsylvanians have already lost access to affordable health coverage, and more than 200,000 Pennsylvanians are expected to lose SNAP assistance, or have already lost, SNAP assistance, as federal policy changes continue to take effect. These costs do not disappear. They are shifted onto states, onto hospitals and healthcare providers, onto counties, and ultimately they are shifted onto our families. Pennsylvania cannot control every decision made in Washington, but we can decide how prepared it wants to be to respond. We have the wealth and we have the economic capacity. The question is whether we will build a tax system that draws fairly from that wealth, so we have the resources to maintain essential services, respond to federal cost shifting, and continue making Pennsylvania more affordable for everyone. So as we head toward November, I believe the most important question is not simply who wins the election, but who is prepared to finish the work this budget left unfinished. Every candidate for governor, for General Assembly, should be prepared to answer a few basic questions. How will you help Pennsylvanians earn more? How will you lower the essential costs families face? Will you continue Pennsylvania's commitment to adequately funding education, public education? How will you respond to growing federal cost shifting? How will you build a fair and sustainable revenue system capable of supporting those priorities? As a nonpartisan policy organization, Pennsylvania Policy Center doesn't answer those questions for voters. Our responsibility is to ensure every Pennsylvanian understands the stakes, every candidate has the opportunity to answer those questions, and whoever is elected is held accountable for the commitments they make. Because elections determine who governs, but budgets determine whether working families can afford to live, work, and thrive in Pennsylvania. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicity, for really helping to set that context. And thank you to all of our panelists for really providing some in-depth, helpful information. Thank you to all of you who are here, and thank you for the questions that folks have been dropping into the chat. We do have about close to 15 minutes left here. We're going to get through as many of these as we can. If you have additional questions, drop them in the chat. We'll see how many we can get to. Let's dig right in with the questions then. Starting off with some questions related to education. This is one that comes from Reverend Gregory Holston, who I just want to note for folks is one of the board members of the Pennsylvania Policy Center. We're really glad for his leadership and to have him here. Reverend Holston asks a great question. How are these educational funding increases addressing not just adequacy, but also racial equity? And a note that Felicity dropped in the chat there that PPC just has a report. It's getting published later today, in fact, that digs into that. Priyanka or Laura, if you want to chime in on that, feel free.
Sure. Well, if you guys have a report, I'm happy to let you all take the first part of the question, and I can chime in after.
Thanks. All right, Laura Beltran.
Perfect. Yes. So we have a report coming out later today, which is our second iteration of the quartile analysis. So basically what we do is we look at the number of students in school districts and we separate them across lower income, Hispanic, and African American students. And then we try to see where are these major investments in education really going to. So as it was expected, the schools that had majoritarily the largest gaps were those in low income, well, it happened something very interesting with Hispanic and African American students because they tend to occur at the extremes. So they tend to occur in lower income districts and urban areas. But then we also have very, very, very small concentrations in rural areas, just because that's kind of how the discrimination, like, the distribution of these goes. But what we find ultimately is that the majority of these resources are going to schools with the biggest gaps, which happen to be the ones that also are the most diverse schools and the ones with lowest incomes. So, just by the way adequacy is set, and the way it is distributed out, we do see that they're also closing these gaps. And when we actually see the distribution of schools, we get to see that a lot of the adequacy schools are, I mean, they're spread, but there's a significant amount that goes towards urban areas. And these are the ones that tend to have a higher diverse distribution of students. So we do see that they are not only closing gaps among lower income, middle income, and higher income students, but we also see that they're closing racial gaps. And I also think this would be a great moment to hint at our research, which we did with PA Schools Work, which is our adequacy report, which shows these specific uses that are going out with the adequacy funds to each schools. And we find obviously different use among schools, but the trend is really that they are going to where schools need it the most. So where there are teacher shortages, where there needs to be education and expansion on childcare. So yes, the short answer is yes, they're closing the racial gaps. They're more importantly, or equally as importantly, closing the lower income gaps, which I think is probably their main goal. Priyanka, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks. That was a really great overview. I'll just add a couple of key statistics that I think about because yes, our public school funding system is still broken, and a big part of that brokenness is racial inequity in the way that our schools are funded. And as I mentioned before, there's 364 school districts that have an adequacy gap, and that's defined through a formula that says these are the school districts that don't have enough to meet the not for an excellent education, for an adequate education, like just to have enough basic teachers, school supplies, safe environment. So 364 school districts, right? 73% of all Pennsylvania students attend inadequately funded schools. But for our Black and Latino students, those numbers are much higher. 82% of our Black students in Pennsylvania attend an inadequately funded school, and 85% of our Latino students do. And so when we talk about adequacy gaps closing, that is also racial equity gaps closing. And so, and that's because the way that schools have historically been funded is tainted with racial discrimination. So all the dollars that are going through this formula are making a really big impact in changing some of these racial equity issues we have in our public schools.
Thanks so much for that question, Reverend Holston, and thank you to Laura and Priyanka for addressing that. Another question here related to education, and I think this is probably a little bit more speculative, but I'll open it up for anybody who wants to chime in on this. Beth asks a question and says, I have heard that there were no increases to educational improvement tax credit program and the Opportunity Scholarship tax credit because Governor Shapiro will accept the federal voucher system. Is this true? I think this is speculative, but Laura, Priyanka, any thoughts, or Felicity?
I'm not in the business of predicting what our elected officials are going to do. I can say I hope not. I hope that we keep our public dollars in public schools. I hope that the commitment to public school funding that we've seen in this year's budget stays that way. And that Governor Shapiro does not opt into this federal voucher program, but it remains to be seen.
Good reminder to keep the pressure on, reminding everybody that vouchers are a way of dismantling public education, and we have to stand up and say no every single time. Moving on to a few other topics, and some of these are topics we didn't necessarily address directly today. So some of these may go to some of the PA Policy Center team, but others feel free to chime in as well. Tim asks a great question about housing. Says, could the panel touch on some housing issues at this point? The state released its housing action plan in February, and in theory, some of its ideas were supposed to be reflected in the budget, but I haven't heard much, if anything, about how that panned out. Anyone on PA Policy Center team or anybody else who might want to chime in?
Yes. So one of the things we heard when the budget was the proposed budget was being rolled out was investments that would amount roughly to $1 billion in housing investment. This obviously did not end up happening. It is part of the roughly 1.8 billion that were cut from the proposed budget to the actual enacted one. So for ongoing housing funding, what we can say is that most of the current investments are pretty much, if not inflation adjusted, they're just maintained. So in the proposed budget, we saw that there were smaller targeted housing and homeless investments, but these did not end up happening. And then we see FARA funding just appear to continue increasing basically to keep up with inflation. I believe it was just like roughly 10 million increase. I can double check and send it in chat. But also if you can drop your email, I can give you a more concise explanation.
Thanks for that question, Tim, and thank you, Laura, for addressing that. I think this may be another one for you, Laura. It's a quick question here. It's from Tanita. The question is it true that CHIP funding decreased? By the way, for folks, CHIP is a healthcare program that helps children across Pennsylvania. Laura, is it true CHIP funding decreased?
No, it increased by 7.9%. However, I think a lot of these bigger concerns that we're hearing is that on the federal side, there might be some potential decreases on CHIP. And also we are slowly heading into Reconciliation 3.0. That's supposedly the down low for September and October. So an increase of 7.9, especially as people are losing SNAP and losing other social support services, is probably not going to be enough, but it did increase 7.9%.
Good to know. Thanks for giving us the factual information, Laura. That's something that we pride ourselves here on the Pennsylvania Policy Center. Another question, not one of the ones we addressed directly today, but we have talked about this in the past in some of our policy action Zoom meetings. Judith's question is, I was wondering about funding for public transit in the budget.
Yes. So there were no increases for public funding. It actually stayed pretty much the same. As I mentioned in my remarks, the proposed budget had offered I believe it was a 1.75% transfer from the sales tax to the transit fund. However, this did not end up happening. We did not see any major changes. And I think, especially because last year we did see that capital line to operating line movement, we're probably going to have some bigger questions about how capital investments are going to be funded in this upcoming budget.
Thank you, Laura. Talking about how we pay for things and how we fund things, there is a comment and question here from Dr. Tony Richardson Rowley, who's asking about legalization of cannabis. The questions are, what about safety issues for children in states that have legalized cannabis? Huge threats to children due to accidental ingestion. So the question is there a way to advocate for guardrails in the legislation? Keep in mind, we have not moved forward on any of the cannabis revenue packages yet. Laura, any thoughts on that, or Felicity?
So one of, among the conversations we've had leading up to this budget was with both the House and the Senate. And in one of those conversations, the fact that we need a cannabis review board was brought up. And I imagine that review board would probably handle some of those specific regulations of how cannabis legalization, taxation, and regulation would be handled. With that said, I do think there are states that have shifted a lot of the cannabis related investments to education and to social services. So definitely, I think in the chat it was mentioned that a portion of the revenue generated by cannabis legalization and regulation could be brought specifically into that. So I think there are definitely opportunities for advocacy. Remembering this is not necessarily a bipartisan issue, and there's, it's been a contentious issue for years, because cannabis has a lot more issues solely than revenue generation, and I'm gonna leave it at that. Felicity, I don't know if you want to add anything else.
The only thing I would add is that so a lot of the rhetoric and conversations around cannabis legalization have been advancing fear-based myths. So we do know from states that have legalized marijuana, cannabis, that there are no real increases in violent crime. Like there's no strong evidence related to that, as well as to some of the youth access. Again, no evidence about about like youth access increasing dramatically after legalization. Again, some of this wouldn't be surprising, keeping in mind that unfortunately there is a pretty robust illegal market for this. And so legalizing it is not going to change those current conditions, right? Other than we now would be able to tax it, and it goes from being a legal market, very similar to how at one point alcohol was illegal, right, in our country, and now it is legal again, but how it is regulated. So again, I want to be really clear that a lot of the myths around this are fear-based, and we just have not been realized in states where marijuana or cannabis has been legalized and regulated.
Thank you, Felicity. Thank you, Laura. Moving on here to the issue of tax fairness and how we raise revenue. And this is kind of from two different folks, and I know, Felicity, you have some thoughts on this. So I'm hoping you can chime in too. From Christopher, after implementing the fair share tax, Massachusetts raised $2.2 billion that went to fully funding K-12, making community college free, and the remaining balance went into public transit. PA has more millionaires and billionaires than Massachusetts does. Imagine what our state could do. And another part here, Christopher also had dropped in something saying, scrap the uniformity clause. Residents in the Commonwealth deserve a fairer tax system. For folks who don't know, the uniformity clause says that any tax levied in Pennsylvania has to be levied at the same percentage on all people and all folks who are paying the tax. It really prevents us from doing what we have at the federal level, which is a progressive tax, where the people who are wealthier pay a higher percentage. But I know we've thought about this issue a lot at Pennsylvania Policy Center, about how we have a fair tax system and about the uniformity clause. So Felicity, some thoughts you might have.
Yes. So I just want to touch on the fact that everything you said is, of course, accurate, Jeff. And we can have a fairer tax system while also still having the uniformity clause in our Pennsylvania Constitution. That is a position at Pennsylvania Policy Center. There has been legal analysis done on it, but we are going to do even more legal analysis headed up into this upcoming year. Just really shortly, our personal income tax is broken down into several subcategories. What we are proposing as a fair share tax would be saying that those subcategories that are income from work, so wages, salaries, and interest, should be taxed at a uniform rate. And actually, we propose a tax cut for working families and for work, right? That matches the uniform clause, because it doesn't matter if you are earning, technically then, $1 million in wages a year or $30,000 in wages a year, you are paying the same personal income tax rate, a uniform income tax rate on those wages. We would then raise taxes on the other subcategories of income. So things like dividends. So if you are earning income from dividends, then you need to pay a higher personal income tax rate on those dividends. And so we would propose an increase. So we propose a cut to income from work and raising income from taxes. Now, I want to say just really briefly, because I know we're over time, but we have so many questions on this topic, that one of the reasons that we believe we are able to do that is because these 8 subcategories, these 8 subclasses of income exist. There's a reason our tax code does not allow you to carry losses from wages to dividends. That means that each of these types of income is distinct and different. And so each type of income should be able to have its own personal income tax rate, so long as it is uniformly applied across that income subcategory. And so that's something that we're definitely pushing for here. We'll do more in separate sessions on that, but just wanted to touch on that because it's an important one.
All right. Thank you so much, Felicity. We're going to go to our panelists here for just a real quick closing thought from each one of them. But before we do that, and we are a little bit over time here, I got so excited hearing about all this stuff, I didn't even pay attention what time it was. But we do want to note for folks that we have these policy action meetings. We've been actually having 2 of them every month over the last year. We will be taking the month of August off, so there will not be a policy action Zoom meeting coming up in August, but we will be back in September. We will send around email with all of the information and stuff from today's meeting, and we do have this video available online. It'll be on our YouTube page and on our Facebook page. Thank you to my colleagues at PA Policy Center, Felicity, Kirsten, Adrian, Laura, for all of your help here today. Thank you to our panelists, Priyanka, Laura, for your really helpful and informative information. Closing thoughts, final words here. Priyanka, you first.
I would just say there's so much work to be done, and a lot of it is really hard. And one place where we have a lot of positive momentum, like if you just need a little break from the really, really hard, like, changing people's mind from 0 to 100, and you just want to get on a train that's already moving, come join us at PA Schools Work for our statewide movement. We're already in year 3, going into year 4 of really big state budget wins, and we'd love to have you join us. So I'm going to put the link for that in the chat, and hope to see you all soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Priyanka. Laura, Nevitt.
Hey, I got a very quick, hopefully it'll stick in your head, a living wage for all workers in Pennsylvania. It's that simple. And if I'm going to put my email, if you are interested in learning more about, there's a national campaign, there's a state level campaign. This work is happening in places all over the country to get us to a living wage for all workers. And I'm going to put my email in the chat. We also have a petition where if folks just want to sign a petition saying that they think there should be a living wage for all workers. And I'll put those in the chat, and hopefully you will join us in this fight. Thanks so much.
All right. Laura Beltran.
2 very short ones. 1, Pennsylvania should take up the slack of everything that's going on at the federal level, and we should be proactive, not reactive. And 2, because we're a PPC, we need to raise sustainable revenue in a way that protects the individuals that earn the least and are disadvantaged, and more particularly a way that makes corporations and really wealthy individuals pay their fair share.
Thank you, Laura. And the final word from the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Policy Center to close us out, Felicity.
Well, Priyanka stole what I had in saying that literally that there is a lot of work that we have to do. We've really got to roll up our sleeves and get serious about this. I do want to touch on really briefly as a final word. Laura brought up the fact that our U.S. House has already taken steps to advance a Reconciliation 3.0 bill. We've also heard from our U.S. Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, that they intend to do a Reconciliation 4.0. Now, the Reconciliation 3.0, they intend to do before the November election, and Reconciliation 4.0 after. Now, keep in mind that all of this is fluid. But what does this mean? We know that there are very serious concerns about additional tax cuts for billionaires and wealthy corporations. There are very serious concerns about continuing to dismantle our social safety net, so continuing additional cuts to healthcare access and to food access and other public benefits, housing, etc. So I want to be really clear that we have a lot of work, as I said, here to do in Pennsylvania, and that Pennsylvania can be the leading model. It can be the response to ensure that we are prepared and that we have the resources we need to take care of Pennsylvanians, even if our federal government won't take care of us.
All right. A really sobering way to close out the meeting, but it's the reality of what we have. We have a lot to look at and a lot ahead of us. And we're really glad to have all of you folks who joined us here today as part of this effort to continue to push for the things that all Pennsylvanians need, not just to survive, but also to thrive. Again, join us back again in September for our policy action series when we resume. Have a great rest of your summer, everybody.